It was Sunday morning when Marina arrived at church with her 6-year-old daughter. She always liked to sit in the front rows, closer to the altar. But when she moved toward the front pews, the pastor raised his hand and said loudly so everyone could hear, "These seats are reserved." Marina stopped, confused. Reserved for whom? The pastor looked at her coldly and replied, "For important people." She felt her blood run cold. Everyone in the church turned to look. Her daughter pulled her hand, not understanding. Marina stepped back, embarrassed, and went to sit in the last pews where nobody wanted to be. But what she didn't know was that this was only the beginning of something much worse. Comment: is this leadership or elitism? I want to know what you would do in this situation. My name is Marina. I'm 34 years old, a single mother, and I work as a cleaning assistant at a municipal school in the neighborhood. My life has always been surrounded by challenges, but I try to handle everything with dignity and hope, even when the world insists on pointing out the limits of my social condition. Since I was little, I was taught that the church was the only place where the poor and the rich had the same value, where no one needed to worry about appearance, clothing, or the type of car they drove. There, they said, what mattered was faith, character, the sincere desire to seek God. That's why I always believed that inside the church there would be acceptance, even on difficult days. I've never been one for luxury. I work hard Monday through Saturday, cleaning classrooms, bathrooms, and hallways that almost no one sees clean, but everyone notices when they're dirty. I raise my daughter Julia alone. She's 6 years old, my companion every Sunday morning, those mornings when we get ready with care to go to service together. Juju, as I like to call her, loves going to church. She loses herself singing the hymns, gets excited during prayer moments, and has fun coloring the biblical drawings that the Sunday school teachers hand out. I also think it's important for her to grow up with values, to feel that she's part of a community, to have friends, to learn about compassion and kindness alongside people of faith. That Sunday, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I woke up early, prepared bread and coffee, helped Julia choose a light blue dress, her favorite. Before we left, I combed her hair, made a braid decorated with a pink bow, and tried to fix mine as best as possible. At no point did I worry about not having expensive clothes or fashionable shoes. I always heard from my mother that poverty doesn't have to mean sloppiness, and I make a point of teaching this to my daughter every day through small actions. We arrived at church a few minutes before service. The parking lot was already almost full. From a distance, I recognized the black SUV of the car dealership owner, the councilman's pickup truck, the sedan of the businessman who opened the big pharmacy on the main avenue. They, who always seemed to arrive early, occupied the best spots, closest to the entrance door. I received some hurried greetings, other indifferent looks, but I kept going, focused on finding a good place to sit with Julia. Already accustomed to the movement, I entered through the side door, where the flow of people was lighter. The church was full, but there were still empty pews. The first 3 rows were completely empty, which was unusual, as most people like to sit in front to see the altar and musicians better. Julia, excited, pulled me by the hand and asked us to sit there. I saw in her eyes a special sparkle, one of those small joys that only a child feels when something unexpected happens. I also thought it was luck and readily accepted. We crossed the center aisle. Some people looked away, others gave timid smiles. We reached the first rows, and before we could sit down, I felt a presence beside me. It was Pastor Marcelo, with a serious face, holding the Bible under his arm. For a second, I thought he was going to welcome us, but his expression was different, colder than I expected. I tried to smile to disguise my nervousness. "These seats are reserved," he stated in a firm yet polite tone, but loud enough for others to hear. I stood there, looking puzzled, waiting for an explanation. "Reserved? For whom?" I asked, without hiding my surprise. The pastor fixed his gaze on me and replied, "They're for important people." At that moment, I felt the gazes of several people around me, a chill down my spine, as if I had done something wrong. Julia just looked at me, not understanding the reason for that interruption. I took a deep breath and tried to argue. All 3 rows are empty. Haven't the guests arrived yet? The pastor made a vague gesture, as if explaining this were obvious. They're seats for businessmen, politicians, leaders. A way of thanking them for the contributions that keep the church running, he said, almost whispering, but someone from the nearby pew heard and discreetly turned their face. I was paralyzed for a few seconds, without reaction. The sound of worship songs began loudly on the microphone, the voice of the musical group echoing in the spacious hall. But to me, the world seemed silent and distant. I looked at my daughter, hoping to find some comfort in her innocence. Instead, I received the question that hurt me most. "Mom, why can't we stay close?" My eyes welled up. I ran my hand over her head, trying to smile. "Today we're going to sit in the back, okay? We'll talk about it later, all right?" I didn't want to lose control in front of everyone. I saw the pastor open a forced smile, and soon after, turn away to greet the councilman who had just entered through the main door with his whole family. They were immediately invited to sit in the front rows by the pastor himself, who seemed to be officiating more of a VIP event than a service for the community. I went to the back of the hall, sat on the most distant pew, trying to maintain my dignity and especially my smile for my daughter. The air there was hotter, stuffy, and I could barely see the altar or hear the message properly. I felt the embarrassment, the shame, the suffering of not being considered important enough. I tried to sing the hymns, tried to trust that it was just a misunderstanding, but inside I was shattered. Throughout the entire service, Julia didn't color any drawing and stayed quiet, hugging me. I saw that joy disappear from her eyes. I looked at the first rows and thought about how that scene reinforced divisions I had always tried to deny to myself. On the way out, we avoided talking to the usual people. I quickened my pace, holding Julia's hand. On the way home, she asked, "Mum, aren't we important to God?" That question broke my heart in a way I can't explain. I crouched down, looked into her eyes, and said the most sincere thing I could. "You are the person I love most in this world, and to God, we are all important, no matter where we sit. But unfortunately, not everyone believes that, like we do." She nodded slowly, but I saw she still wasn't convinced. I spent the rest of the day in silence, trying to understand what had happened, feeling a mixture of anger, sadness, and helplessness. That night I couldn't sleep. I could only think about how to explain the injustices of the world to a child who believes in the best in people. And so, with a tight chest, I decided to no longer ignore what was before me. I realized the problem wasn't mine. The problem was a system created to promote those who can give more, while many others remain invisible. The feeling of revolt grew, and this was only the first time I felt this pain in church. Little did I know that this situation would mark the beginning of an even greater conflict, one that would change my relationship with faith, with the church, with people, and with myself. On Monday, I woke up tired, as if I hadn't slept. The scenes from Sunday kept replaying in my head, the pastor preventing me from sitting in front, people's stares, Julia's question, "Mum, aren't we important?" That phrase haunted me throughout the early morning. I got up, prepared breakfast, dropped my daughter off at school, and went to work as always, but with a heavy heart, carrying a sadness I couldn't disguise. I arrived at the school where I work and began my routine. I grabbed the cleaning cart, filled the bucket with water and detergent, put on my gloves and started cleaning the hallways. The smell of disinfectant, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty building. Everything seemed heavier that day. While I scrubbed the floor, I thought about how the humiliation I felt on Sunday seemed to have stuck to me like a stain I couldn't remove, no matter how hard I tried. During the morning break, I went to the cafeteria for coffee. I was alone, looking out the window, lost in thought, when Donna Celia, the school cook, approached with a cup in her hand. She also attended the same church as me. We had known each other for a few years, exchanged greetings at services, but had never talked deeply about anything. She pulled up a chair and sat beside me with a look of someone who knew exactly what I was feeling. "Marina, "I saw what happened yesterday at the service," she said in a low tone, almost whispering, as if afraid of being heard. My heart tightened. "You saw it?" I asked, feeling the shame return. She nodded slowly, with an expression of sadness in her eyes. "Everyone saw it, dear. The pastor wasn't discreet at all. And look, it wasn't the first time this has happened. I've seen other people being barred from those pews too." I felt a lump in my throat. It wasn't just me then. This was a recurring practice, something the pastor did openly, without any embarrassment. "How long has this been happening?" I asked, trying to understand the scope of it all. Donna Celia sighed deeply before answering. "About 6 months or so. It started after the church went through that major renovation, remember? The pastor said he needed to value those who contributed more financially. He calls those pews preferential seats. Anyone who donates above a certain monthly amount has the right to sit there." I was dumbfounded. This was worse than I had imagined. It wasn't just a matter of personal preference or who arrived first. It was an organized system, an internal church policy that divided people between important and common. "But this is completely wrong," I exclaimed, feeling indignation growing inside me. "Shouldn't the church be a place where everyone is equal before God?" Donna Celia agreed, shaking her head sadly. "It should be, yes. But that's not what's happening. Many people were uncomfortable when this started. Some long-time members even left the church because of it, but most prefer to stay quiet. Pastor Marcello is very influential, you know. He has friendships with politicians, businessmen, powerful people. Nobody wants to cross him." She paused, looked around to make sure no one was listening, and continued, "If I were you, I wouldn't bring this up with him. I've seen people being removed from leadership, losing positions in the church, being isolated from the community for much less." Those words left me even more disturbed. Should I simply accept this? Pretend nothing happened and continue attending church as if everything were fine? But how could I do that? How could I look at my daughter and teach her about justice, about dignity, about equality, if I myself didn't have the courage to question such a clear and glaring injustice? I spent the rest of the day thinking about it. I cleaned the classrooms mechanically, not paying attention to what I was doing. My mind was elsewhere, trapped in that Sunday of humiliation. When I finally finished work and went to pick up Julia from school, she greeted me with a tight hug. But I noticed she was also quieter than usual. On the way home, she asked me, "Mom, are we going back to that church?" The question caught me by surprise. I stopped walking and looked at her. "Why are you asking that, my love?" She shrugged, looking at the ground. "I didn't like it there. People were mean to us." I felt my heart break. My daughter, at only 6 years old, had already learned a cruel lesson about how the world works, and I felt powerless, unable to protect her from that pain. Still, the following Sunday, I returned to church. I'm not sure why. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was an irrational hope that things could be different, or maybe it was just because Julia, despite everything, still liked singing the hymns and coloring the biblical drawings. This time, we arrived earlier. When we entered, the first 3 rows were already occupied. The councilman, the businessman, the car dealership owner's family, all there as always. And we, once again, went to the back. During the service, Pastor Marcello gave a sermon about generosity. He spoke at length about how God blesses those who give joyfully, who contribute to the work, who invest in the kingdom. And then, in the middle of the sermon, he did something that completely shocked me. He began to publicly thank the church's major donors. He called each of them by name, asked them to stand up, and the entire congregation applauded. It was like a spectacle, a public celebration of wealth and influence. I sat there, hands in my lap, not applauding. I looked around and realized I wasn't the only one. There were other people who weren't applauding either. People like me, simple, hard-working people who contributed what they could, but who would never be called to stand up, would never be publicly recognized, would never have a reserved pew. I felt a deep anger, a revolt that burned inside me. When the service ended, I saw the pastor chatting animatedly with the pharmacy businessman. They were laughing, patting each other on the back, seeming like old friends. And then something inside me broke. I decided I could no longer stay silent. I waited until most people left. Then I took a deep breath, gathered all the courage I had, and approached the pastor. He was putting some papers in a folder when he saw me. He smiled, but it was a polite, distant smile. "Marina, everything okay?" he asked without much attention. "Pastor, I need to talk to you about something that's bothering me a lot," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He frowned, as if surprised. "Of course. What is it?" "It's about the reserved pews. I don't understand why this division exists. Doesn't the Bible teach that we are all equal before God?" I asked, looking directly into his eyes. The smile disappeared from the pastor's face. He looked at me with a serious expression, almost irritated. "Marina, the church needs resources to function. These people who sit in front are the main supporters. They sustain the work. It's fair that they receive recognition. But recognition can't be a better place in the temple," I replied, feeling courage grow. "This creates a hierarchy. It makes people like me feel less important, less worthy." He sighed, impatient. "You're exaggerating. No one is less important. We simply recognize in a special way those who give more. If you want to sit in front, you can increase your contribution." I was speechless. Had he really just said that? That I could buy my seat in front? I felt tears burning in my eyes, but I refused to cry there in front of him. "I contribute what I can, Pastor, and I've always done so joyfully. But it seems that's not enough to be treated with dignity here," I said, with a trembling voice. He crossed his arms, adopting a defensive posture. "Marina, if you're dissatisfied, maybe you should look for another church, a place that aligns better with your expectations." Those words were like a slap in the face. He wasn't willing to listen. He wasn't willing to reflect. He simply suggested I leave. I left the church that day with a broken heart, not because of losing a pew in front, but because of losing something much greater, the belief that that place was truly a faith community where everyone was welcome and valued, and the worst was yet to come. After that conversation with Pastor Marcelo, something changed inside me. It wasn't just anger or sadness. It was a feeling of displacement, as if I no longer belonged in that place. During the following days, I carried that weight in my chest, trying to understand how an institution that should preach love and equality could treat people so unequally. I spent the week immersed in contradictory thoughts. Part of me just wanted to forget everything, move on, look for another church where I would feel welcome. But another part, perhaps the more stubborn one, refused to accept that as normal. Why should I leave? Why should people like me be the ones who leave, while the pastor stayed there, perpetuating an unjust system? On Wednesday night, I received a WhatsApp message. It was from Vanessa, a young woman who attended the church and whom I knew superficially from services. She worked as an attendant at a veterinary clinic and had always seemed like a sweet, polite person to me. "Hi, Marina. Can I ask you a question? I heard you questioned the pastor about the reserved pews. Is it true?" I was surprised. How did she know about that? I replied yes, that I had talked to him about the matter. She took a few minutes to respond, and when she did, her message was long and filled with emotion. "Marina, I wanted to thank you for having the courage to speak up. I've also been uncomfortable with this for a long time, but I never had the courage to say anything. Yesterday, during choir rehearsal, I heard the pastor talking about you with some members of the leadership. He said you were causing division in the church and that you needed to be counseled." My heart raced. Causing division? Me? All I did was question a practice I considered unfair. And now, the pastor was labeling me as a problematic person? I replied to Vanessa asking what else he had said. She hesitated, but eventually told me. "He said you don't understand how the church works, that you have a poor person's mentality, and that this prevents you from seeing the need to value those who truly sustain the work." Some people agreed with him, but others remained silent. I was there, and I was very uncomfortable. I felt a mixture of anger and humiliation. Poor person's mentality. That was a direct insult, an attempt to disqualify me, to reduce my criticism to a matter of envy or resentment. But it wasn't about that. It was about principles, about values, about what the church should represent. I thanked Vanessa for telling me and asked her to be discreet, as I didn't want her to get into trouble because of me. That night, I could barely sleep. I kept thinking about the pastor's words, about how he had disqualified me in front of other people, and I wondered how many other people had already been treated this way, how many had already been silenced, humiliated, pushed away for daring to question. The following Sunday, I returned to church. I don't know if it was out of stubbornness or a distorted sense of duty, but I felt I couldn't simply give up. Julia was excited, as always, singing on the way. When we arrived, I noticed something was different. People were looking at me strangely. Some looked away when I tried to greet them. Others whispered among themselves when I passed by. I sat in the back, as had become customary. The service began normally, with praise, hymns, prayers, announcements. But when it was time for the sermon, Pastor Marcelo went up to the pulpit with a serious expression. He opened the Bible, read a verse about authority and submission, and began to preach in a way that made me extremely uncomfortable. "Brothers and sisters, we live in difficult times," he began, with a firm voice. "Times when people question everything, disrespect authorities, think they know more than those God has placed to lead. But the Bible is clear. We must submit to authorities, whether civil or spiritual, because all authority comes from God." He paused, looked at the congregation and continued, "There are people in this church who are sowing discord, who are questioning decisions that were made with wisdom and prayer. These people need to understand that the church is not a democracy. It's a theocracy, and God has established leaders to guide the flock." I felt my face get hot. He was talking about me. There was no doubt. That sermon was a direct response to my conversation with him. I looked around and noticed that some people had also understood. Some looked at me with curiosity, others with disapproval. I felt Julia pull my hand. "Mom, why is that man talking like that?" she asked, with the innocence of someone who doesn't understand the nuances of the situation. "He's preaching, my love," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm, but inside I was trembling. The pastor continued for more than 40 minutes. He talked about rebellion, about pride, about how the devil uses people to cause division in churches, and with each word I felt the weight of stares upon me. It was as if I were being publicly judged, with no right to defense. When the service ended, I left quickly, holding Julia's hand tightly. But before I reached the door, a woman stopped me. It was Marlene, one of the leaders of the church's women's group. She was known for being close to the pastor, one of his main supporters. "Marina, can we talk for a minute?" she asked with a forced smile. I took a deep breath and agreed, asking Julia to wait outside with Donna Celia, who had offered to stay with her. Marlene took me to a private room, closed the door, and crossed her arms. "Marina, I need to be direct with you. The pastor is concerned about your attitude. He feels you are disrespecting the leadership, questioning decisions that are none of your business." I tried to defend myself. "Marlene, I only questioned a practice I consider unfair. I'm not trying to cause division. I just want to understand why there are reserved pews in a place that should be equal for everyone." She shook her head impatiently. "You don't understand, Marina. The church needs resources, and these people who sit in front are the ones who keep everything running. Without them, we wouldn't have electricity, we wouldn't have sound, we wouldn't have structure. It's fair that they be recognized. But recognition shouldn't be a privileged place in the temple," I insisted. "That goes against everything the Bible teaches." Marlene looked at me coldly. "Marina, if you don't agree with the way the church is run, maybe it's better to look for another place. No one is forcing you to stay here." Those words hit me like a punch in the stomach. It was the second time someone had suggested I leave, and this time it wasn't just the pastor, it was the entire leadership that was rejecting me. I left that room with tears in my eyes. I found Julia waiting outside, holding Donna Celia's hand. I thanked her, took my daughter, and we left. On the way home, Julia asked me, "Mom, why don't those people like you?" I tried to explain in a way she could understand. Sometimes when we speak the truth, some people don't like it. But that doesn't mean we're wrong. In the following days, I started receiving strange messages. Some were supportive, from people who agreed with me but were afraid to speak up. Others were disapproving, saying I was causing unnecessary problems. And then, on Friday, I received a call from Pastor Marcelo. He asked me to come to the church on Saturday afternoon for a counseling meeting. My heart tightened. I knew this wouldn't be a simple conversation. On Saturday afternoon, I dressed in my best clothes and went to the church with a heavy heart. I didn't know what to expect from that meeting, but I had a bad feeling. When I arrived, I was greeted by a secretary who took me to a meeting room at the back of the temple. Inside, Pastor Marcelo, Marlene, and 2 more members of the leadership were already there. Deacon Carlos and the teaching coordinator, Sister Beatrice. The pastor asked me to sit down and with a cold smile began to speak. "Marina, thank you for coming. We called you here because we are concerned about you. We have noticed that you are dissatisfied with some things in the church, and we thought it important to clarify some points." I took a deep breath and replied, "Pastor, I'm not dissatisfied with the church. I'm dissatisfied with a specific practice that I consider unfair." He interrupted. "I understand. But you need to understand that the church has a structure, an organization, and that not everything can be decided collectively. There are decisions that fall to the leadership, and one of them is how we recognize our main donors." I tried to argue again. "But Pastor, the Bible says in James 2 that we should not show favoritism. We should not treat the rich better than the poor." Marlene interjected, "Marina, you're taking that verse out of context. What we're doing isn't favoritism. It's recognition of contributions. It's different." I felt frustration growing. It's not different. Reserving the best seats for those who donate more is exactly what James condemns. It's creating a hierarchy based on money. Deacon Carlos, who had been silent until then, decided to speak. "Marina, with all due respect, you are being prideful. You are placing your judgment above the leadership's judgment, and that is dangerous. The Bible speaks about rebellion." That accusation shocked me. Pride? Rebellion? All I was doing was defending a basic biblical principle. The pastor then changed strategy. "Marina, I'm going to be honest with you. If you continue to publicly question the decisions of this church, we're going to have to take disciplinary measures. We cannot allow someone to cause division in the body of Christ." I felt my heart race. "Disciplinary measures? Are you threatening me?" He raised his hand as if trying to calm the situation. "It's not a threat, it's a warning. We want you to continue being part of this community, but for that, you need to submit to the authority established by God." I looked at each of those people and realized there was no room for dialogue. They weren't there to listen to me. They were there to intimidate me, to force me to accept something I considered wrong. I stood up from the chair. "Pastor, I respect you and the leadership of this church very much, but I cannot accept something that goes against the word of God. If you consider this rebellion, then I don't know what else to say." I grabbed my purse and headed for the door. Before leaving, I turned and said, "You talk so much about submission, but you forget that all of us, including leaders, must submit to God and His Word, and the Word is clear. God shows no favoritism." I left that room trembling. I sat on the front pew of the empty church and let the tears fall. I felt a mixture of relief for having spoken my mind and fear of what would come next. I stayed there for a few minutes in silence, trying to process everything, and then I heard footsteps behind me. It was Vanessa, the young woman who had messaged me days before. "Marina, I heard what happened. I was outside and overheard part of the conversation," she said, sitting beside me. "You were very brave." I wiped away the tears and smiled weakly. "I don't know if it was courage or stupidity." She shook her head. "It was courage, and you're not alone. There are more people uncomfortable with this. They just don't have the courage to speak up." I asked her if she thought I should continue attending the church. Vanessa sighed. "I don't know, Marina. Part of me thinks yes, that you should stay and keep fighting. But another part thinks you'll just suffer more. Pastor Marcelo won't change. He's too proud to admit he's wrong. I nodded in agreement. That's what I'm feeling too. The following Sunday, I decided to go to church one more time. I don't know why. Maybe it was one last attempt to see if things could change. But from the moment I entered, I felt hostility in the air. Some people greeted me coldly. Others simply ignored me. I sat in the back, as always, and the service began. During the announcements, Pastor Marcelo did something that completely shocked me. He asked everyone to open their Bibles to Romans 16:17 and read aloud, "I urge you, brothers and sisters, to watch out for those who cause divisions and put obstacles in your way that are contrary to the teaching you have learned. Keep away from them." He closed the Bible, looked at the congregation and said, "Brothers and sisters, we need to be careful with people who cause division, people who question the authority established by God. These people are dangerous and we should stay away from them." I felt all eyes turned to me, some disguised, others not so much. My face burned with shame. The pastor was publicly marking me, labeling me as someone dangerous, someone others should stay away from. I held tightly to Julia's hand, who looked at me without understanding what was happening. When the service ended, I tried to leave quickly, but was intercepted by several people. Some came to rebuke me, saying I was causing problems. Others came to console me, saying they agreed with me but couldn't speak publicly. And then something happened that deeply marked me. An elderly lady, whom I had always respected greatly, approached me and said, "Marina, I heard about what you did. You should be ashamed. Questioning the pastor is questioning God." Those words hit me like an arrow, not because of their truth, but because of the blindness they represented. How could people equate a human, flawed leader with God himself? How could they accept such a clear injustice in the name of blind obedience? I left the church that day, knowing I wouldn't return. Not because I had given up on faith, but because that place was no longer a place of true faith. It was a place of power, of politics, of favoritism, and I could no longer pretend everything was okay. On the way home, Julia asked me, "Mum, are we going back there?" I looked at her and answered honestly, "No, my love. We're going to look for a place where everyone is treated equally." In the following days, I received several messages, some supportive, others disapproving. And then, a week later, I received an official message from Pastor Marcelo. It was a formal disciplinary notification. I was being removed from the church for rebellious behavior and insubordination to leadership. The message said I was no longer welcome at services and that if I returned, I would be asked to leave. I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for losing a community that had been important to me. Relief for no longer having to endure that hypocrisy. I showed the message to Donna Celia, who was outraged. "This is absurd, Marina. They can't do this to you." I shrugged. They can. And they did. And that's how my story at that church ended. Expelled for daring to question an injustice. But at the same time, freed from a system that had transformed faith into a business, the church into an exclusive club. What I didn't know was that this was far from over, because the truth, no matter how much they try to silence it, always finds a way to come to light. After being formally expelled from the church, I spent weeks trying to process what had happened. I woke up every morning with a weight in my chest, a mixture of anger, sadness, and disbelief. How had it come to this? All I did was question an injustice, and now I was treated as if I were a criminal, a dangerous person who needed to be removed. Julia noticed something was wrong. She constantly asked me when we would return to church, and each time I had to explain that we wouldn't be going back anymore, I saw confusion in her eyes. One morning, while we were having breakfast together, she asked me a question that broke my heart. "Mom, was it my fault that we can't go to church anymore?" I immediately put down my cup, crouched down to her level, and held her face with both hands. "Never, never think that, my love. None of this is your fault. Adults sometimes do wrong things, and that's what happened. But inside, I knew this was affecting me deeply. I felt isolated, as if I had lost not only a religious community, but also a social support network. The few friendships I had made at church simply disappeared. Some people stopped responding to my messages. Others blocked me on social media. It was as if I had been erased from their existence. That's when Vanessa called me. She was nervous, speaking quickly, and I could sense that something important had happened. "Marina, you need to know something. There are other people going through the same thing as you, and it's not just at our church. I talked to a friend who attends another denomination in the city, and she told me that the pastor there does the same thing, reserves the best seats for those who donate more." I was shocked. It wasn't an isolated case. This was happening in other places too. "Vanessa, are you sure about this?" she confirmed. "I am. And there's more. There are people wanting to meet to talk about this. People who have been pushed away, humiliated, or who simply don't agree with what's happening. I thought you'd like to know." I felt a spark of hope. Maybe I wasn't alone after all. "When is this meeting?" She gave me the details. It would be next Wednesday night, at the home of a lady named Teresa, who had been a church member for over 20 years before leaving, because she disagreed with the way things were being conducted. On Wednesday, I left Julia with Donna Celia and went to Teresa's house. It was a simple but welcoming house with a well-kept garden in front. When I rang the doorbell, I was greeted by a woman of about 60 years old, with grey hair and a gentle smile. "Marina, come in, please. We're all waiting for you." I entered and saw there were about 10 people in the living room. Some I recognized from church, others were completely unknown. Teresa asked everyone to sit down and started the meeting. "Thank you for coming. I know many of you are going through difficult times. I myself went through this a few years ago when I decided to question certain practices in the church. I was ignored, marginalized, and eventually expelled. But I discovered I wasn't alone, and neither are you." One by one, people began to share their stories. There was a man named Roberto, who had been removed from leadership for questioning the use of church offerings. He discovered that a significant part of the money was being used to pay for personal trips by the pastor and his family, but when he raised the issue, he was accused of not trusting the leadership and removed from his position. There was also a young woman named Bruna, who had been expelled from the youth group for wearing clothes considered inappropriate by the pastor. He publicly humiliated her during a meeting, saying she was seducing the young men with her clothes, even though she was dressed completely normally. She left the church crying and never returned. And there was also an elderly couple, Mr. Antonio and Mrs. Maria, who had been founding members of the church 30 years ago. They said that after Pastor Marcelo took over the leadership, everything changed. The church, which had previously been a welcoming place for everyone, became increasingly focused on the rich and influential. They tried to talk to the pastor several times, but were ignored. Eventually, they decided to leave. Hearing those stories was both comforting and heartbreaking. Comforting because I wasn't alone. Heartbreaking because I realized the problem was much bigger than I had imagined. It wasn't just a matter of reserved pews. It was an entire culture of abuse of power, manipulation, elitism disguised as spiritual leadership. When my turn came to speak, I told my whole story. From the first day I was prevented from sitting in front, to the conversation with the pastor, the counseling meeting, and finally the formal expulsion. As I spoke, I saw tears in the eyes of several people. They understood exactly what I had been through, because they had been through the same thing. At the end of the meeting, Teresa made a proposal. "I know we're all hurt, I know it's difficult, but I think we need to do something, not for revenge, but for justice, so that other people don't go through what we went through. What do you think about documenting all of this and taking it to the denominational pastoral council?" The idea was met with mixed reactions. Some thought it was brave, others thought it was risky. Roberto raised a valid concern. "Do you really think the council will listen to us? Pastor Marcelo has a lot of influence. He's personal friends with several council members." Teresa nodded, That's true, but we can't let fear paralyze us. If we don't try, nothing will change, and more people will suffer. After a long discussion, we decided to move forward. Each person would write a detailed account of what had happened, including dates, names, and, when possible, evidence. Then we would present everything to the pastoral council. I spent the following days writing my account. It was painful to relive all of that, to put on paper each humiliation, each harsh word, each contemptuous look. But it was also liberating. It was as if, by writing, I was finally taking that weight off my chest, releasing all the pain I had kept inside. 2 weeks later, we met again at Teresa's house. Each person brought their account. Teresa compiled everything into a single document, well organized, with attached evidence. There were WhatsApp messages, emails, audio recordings, even photos of the reserved pews, with signs indicating they were for special donors. The document was almost 50 pages long. Teresa scheduled a meeting with the pastoral council. We all went together, a group of 10 hurt but determined people. When we arrived at the denomination's administrative building, we were greeted by a secretary who took us to a conference room. There, 5 members of the pastoral council were present, 3 older pastors and 2 lay people. Teresa presented the document and began to explain the situation. She spoke calmly but firmly, detailing each case, each abuse, each injustice. The council members listened in silence, with expressions ranging from shock, concern, and discomfort. When Teresa finished, one of the pastors, called Reverend Silva, spoke. "This is very serious," he said, flipping through the document. "If everything here is true, we need to take immediate action." I felt a wave of hope. Finally, someone was taking us seriously. But then another council member, a man named Pastor Henrique, raised a concern. "With all due respect, we need to hear the other side as well. Pastor Marcelo has the right to defend himself." Reverend Silva agreed. "Without a doubt, we will summon Pastor Marcelo for a hearing. He will have the opportunity to respond to these accusations." We agreed that the hearing would take place in 2 weeks. We left that meeting with a feeling of partial victory. It wasn't the outcome we expected, but at least we were being heard. In the following days, news of our complaint began to spread. Some people from the church contacted me, congratulating me on my courage. Others sent me aggressive messages, accusing me of destroying God's work and being an instrument of the devil. I tried not to let it affect me, but it was difficult. Each hate message was like a stab wound. Vanessa called me one night, nervous. "Marina, Pastor Marcelo is running a campaign against you all. He said at yesterday's service that there are rebellious people trying to destroy the church with lies. He asked members to pray for the church's protection against the enemy's attacks." I sighed. It was exactly what I expected. The pastor was playing the victim, turning our legitimate complaint into spiritual persecution. But we didn't give up. We continued meeting, supporting each other, preparing for the hearing. Teresa guided us on how to behave, what to say, how to respond to possible attacks. "We need to remain calm and dignified," she would say. "We can't give them reasons to discredit us." Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. We returned to the denomination's administrative building, this time with even more nervousness. When we entered the conference room, we saw that Pastor Marcelo was already there, sitting with a lawyer beside him. My heart tightened. He had brought a lawyer? Shouldn't this be a spiritual matter resolved within the church? Reverend Silva opened the meeting. "We are here to hear both sides regarding the complaints filed against Pastor Marcelo. Pastor, did you have access to the document that was submitted?" Pastor Marcelo nodded. "I did, and I must say I was deeply hurt and disappointed. These accusations are unfounded and represent an attempt to defame my ministry." Teresa asked for the floor. "Pastor Marcelo, we have evidence. We have photos of the reserved pews. We have messages from you confirming the preferential seating policy. How do you explain this?" The pastor was not intimidated. "Yes, we have reserved seats for our main donors. And what's the problem? The church needs resources to function. Recognizing those who contribute significantly is not a sin, it's gratitude, Roberto intervened. But Pastor, the Bible condemns favoritism. James chapter 2 is very clear about this. The pastor gave a condescending smile. You're interpreting that text incorrectly. James talks about not despising the poor, not about not honoring those who sustain the work. They're completely different things. The discussion became increasingly tense. The pastor's lawyer began to question the legitimacy of our evidence, suggesting that the photos could have been taken out of context, that the messages could have been edited. Bruna, the young woman who had been humiliated because of her clothes, tried to speak about her experience, but was interrupted by the lawyer. With all due respect, this is just her word against the pastor's. There's no objective evidence. I felt frustration growing. It seemed that no matter what we said, we wouldn't be taken seriously. Pastor Marcelo was being protected by the system, and we were just pawns that could be easily discarded. That's when something unexpected happened. One of the council members, who had been silent until then, asked to speak. He was an older man named Pastor Elias. I need to say something, he began with a deep voice. I've known Pastor Marcelo for many years, and I must admit that in recent times I've been hearing rumors about his practices, not just about the reserved pews, but about other issues as well. Misuse of resources, favoritism, abuse of authority. I tried to ignore these rumors, thinking they were just gossip, but now, hearing these accounts, I realize there's a pattern, and this deeply concerns me. Pastor Marcelo was visibly shaken. Pastor Elias, with all due respect, you're being influenced by these people. They have an agenda against me. Pastor Elias shook his head. No, Marcelo. It's not a matter of agenda. It's a matter of character. And what I'm seeing here are clear signs that something is wrong in your ministry. Reverend Silva intervened. I believe we need to conduct a more thorough investigation. Pastor Marcelo, you will be temporarily removed from your duties while we investigate these complaints. A committee will be formed to audit the church's finances and interview other members of the congregation. Pastor Marcelo stood up, indignant. This is absurd. You have no authority to remove me. Reverend Silva remained calm. Yes, we do. It's provided for in the denomination's bylaws, and this decision is final. The pastor's lawyer tried to argue, but was cut off. The hearing is adjourned. We will communicate the next steps shortly. We left that room with a mixed feeling of victory and apprehension. Victory because we had finally been heard and taken seriously. Apprehension because we knew this was far from over. Pastor Marcelo would not accept this passively, and we were certain he would do everything to reverse the situation. In the following days, news of the pastor's removal spread quickly. The church went into turmoil. There were those who supported the council's decision and those who vehemently condemned it. Some members organized protests in defense of the pastor. Others left the church in solidarity with us. I received dozens of messages, some supportive, saying I had done the right thing. Others threatening, saying I would pay for having destroyed the church. I had to block several people on social media and even considered changing my phone number. Vanessa was also suffering attacks. She called me crying one night, saying she had lost years-long friendships for having supported me. I tried to console her, but I myself was emotionally exhausted. The investigative committee worked for 3 weeks. They audited the church's finances, interviewed dozens of members, reviewed documents and records, and what they found was even worse than we imagined. Pastor Marcelo not only reserved pews for donors, but also used church money for personal expenses, including vacation trips, dinners at expensive restaurants, and even the purchase of a luxury car registered in his name. In addition, the investigation revealed a pattern of emotional and spiritual abuse. Several people reported having been manipulated, humiliated, and controlled by the pastor. Some were afraid to question anything for fear of being disciplined or cursed. It was a system of control and fear that had been carefully built over the years. When the final report was presented to the pastoral council, the decision was unanimous. Pastor Marcello would be permanently removed from ministry. His ministerial license would be revoked, and he could no longer exercise any pastoral function in the denomination. The church would be temporarily administered by an interim pastor appointed by the council until a new leader was chosen by the congregation. The news was announced at a special service, where Reverend Silva read the complete report before the entire congregation. There was crying, indignation, but also relief. Many people approached me after the service, apologizing for not having believed me before. Some hugged me, crying. Others simply thanked me for having had the courage to speak up. Pastor Marcello was not present at that service. According to what we learned later, he had left the city with his family, trying to start over somewhere else. But news of his removal from ministry had spread, and he would hardly be able to exercise religious leadership anywhere again. That night, I returned home with Julia. She had gone to the service with me, and although she didn't fully understand what was happening, she noticed that something important had been resolved. "Mom, those people were nice to you today," she said, smiling. "Yes, they were, my love," I replied, finally feeling a peace I hadn't felt in months. But I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a healing process, both for me and for all the other people who had been hurt. And it was also a reminder that justice, although sometimes delayed, can prevail when courageous people unite and refuse to accept what is wrong. Marina never imagined her life could change so much because of a church pew. But there she was, months after it all began, witnessing the transformation not only of her own story, but of an entire community that had been silenced for years. Pastor Marcello's removal was just the beginning of a much deeper healing process. In the weeks following the pastor's removal, the church went through a true revolution. The interim pastor appointed by the pastoral council, Reverend Paolo, was a humble man, about 50 years old, known for his welcoming stance and his unwavering defense of justice. When he assumed temporary leadership, the first thing he did was remove the signs from the reserved pews and publicly announce that all seats were available to anyone, without distinction. Marina was present that Sunday. When she saw Reverend Paolo personally removing the signs and declaring that the church was a place of equality, she felt tears streaming down her face. Julia, sitting beside her, asked, "Mom, why are you crying?" Marina smiled through her tears and replied, "These are tears of joy, my love, because finally things are changing for the better." Reverend Paolo also implemented other important changes. He established a transparent financial council, composed of members elected by the congregation, which would oversee all church expenses. He created an anonymous reporting system so that anyone could report abuse of authority without fear of retaliation. And most importantly, he initiated a series of Bible studies on servant leadership, humility, and equality in the body of Christ. Marina began attending services regularly again. At first, she felt uncomfortable, as if she still carried the weight of past humiliation, but gradually she realized the atmosphere had changed completely. People greeted her with genuine affection. Some came to apologize for not having supported her before. Others simply hugged her, thanking her for her courage. Vanessa also returned to the church and became one of the youth group leaders. She organized weekly meetings where young people could openly discuss faith, doubts, and social issues without fear of being judged. Bruna, the young woman who had been humiliated because of her clothes, returned timidly a few weeks later and was received with applause and hugs. She cried so much that she needed to sit for a few minutes before she could speak. Roberto, the man who had discovered the misuse of offerings, was invited to join the new financial council. He accepted, but with one condition, that all financial reports be posted monthly on a bulletin board at the church entrance, so any member could track how the money was being used. Reverend Paolo agreed immediately. Donna Teresa, the lady who had organized the meetings at her house, became a kind of informal church counselor. Many people who had been hurt during Pastor Marcelo's ministry sought her out to talk, cry, vent. She listened to each story with patience and compassion, offering not only comfort but also guidance on how to move forward. One day, about 3 months after Pastor Marcelo's departure, Marina received an unexpected call. It was from a journalist from a local newspaper who had heard about the story and wanted to do a report. Marina hesitated. Part of her just wanted to forget everything and move on. But another part knew that telling her story publicly could help other people who were going through similar situations. She consulted the group of people who had been affected. Some thought it was a good idea. Others were afraid of exposure. After much discussion, they decided to accept, but with one condition. The story would not be about revenge or scandal, but about restoration, justice, and the importance of questioning abusive practices, even within religious institutions. The report was published a few weeks later, occupying 2 full pages of the newspaper. The headline was, "From Humiliation to Restoration, How a Single Mother Transformed a Church by Questioning Religious Elitism." The article told Marina's entire story, from the first day she was prevented from sitting in front to Pastor Marcelo's removal and the changes implemented in the church. The repercussion was immediate. Marina began receiving messages from people across the country, sharing similar stories. Some reported churches where the rich sat in cushioned chairs while the poor stayed on uncomfortable wooden benches. Others spoke of pastors who treated businessmen and politicians as VIP members, giving them access to private meetings and special treatment. One of the messages that touched Marina most was from a woman named Clara from another state. She told how she had been expelled from her church for questioning why the pastor drove a luxury car while many congregation members were in need. Clara said she felt alone and ashamed for years, thinking she had done something wrong. But reading Marina's story, she realized she wasn't alone and that she had done the right thing. Marina responded to Clara and several other people, offering words of encouragement and, when possible, connecting them with resources and support groups. Without planning it, she found herself at the center of an informal network of people who had been hurt by spiritual abuse and were seeking healing and justice. Reverend Paulo, seeing the impact of Marina's story, suggested that the church organize a seminar on spiritual abuse and ethical leadership. The event was scheduled for an entire Saturday and open to the public. Speakers from different denominations were invited to talk about signs of abusive leadership, how to identify them, and what to do when encountering them. The seminar was a success. More than 200 people attended, coming from various churches in the region. There were pastors, leaders, congregation members, and even people who had left the faith because of traumatic experiences with religious leaders. The testimonies were moving, and at the end of the day, many left not only informed, but also encouraged to seek changes in their own communities. Marina was invited to give a brief testimony at the seminar. She went up on stage with trembling legs, but as soon as she began to speak, she felt a deep peace. She told her story with honesty and vulnerability, without omitting the moments of pain, fear, and doubt. And she ended with words that echoed in everyone's hearts. Questioning is not rebellion, it's love, because when we truly love the church, we cannot remain silent in the face of injustices that disfigure it. The hall exploded in applause. People stood up, some crying, others smiling. Marina came down from the stage and was immediately surrounded by dozens of people wanting to hug her, thank her, share their own stories. She spent hours talking with each of them, listening, counseling, crying together. That night, when she finally returned home, Marina lay down beside Julia, who was already asleep. She looked at her daughter's serene face and thought about everything they had been through together, the humiliations, the tears, the fears, but also the courage, the justice, the restoration. And she knew deep in her heart that it had all been worth it. The following months brought even more transformations. The church, under Reverend Paulo's temporary leadership, grew not in numbers, but in depth. People began to be more interested in serious Bible studies than in shows and pompous events. Services became more participatory, with space for testimonies, questions, and discussions. And above all, a culture of transparency and accountability was created that had never existed before. When the time came to choose a new permanent pastor, the congregation was involved democratically. A committee was formed, composed of members of different age groups and social classes, to search for candidates and interview them. Marina was invited to be part of the committee, but politely declined. She felt she had already fulfilled her role and that it was time for other people to assume leadership. However, Marina agreed to be part of a new ministry being created, a support group for victims of spiritual abuse. Together with Teresa, Vanessa, Roberto, and others, she helped structure monthly meetings where people could share their experiences in a safe and welcoming environment. The group grew quickly, and within a few months had more than 30 regular participants. One of the most significant moments for Marina was when a young woman named Camilla appeared at one of the meetings. She was only 17 years old and told through tears that she had been psychologically abused by a youth leader at her church. He manipulated her emotionally, saying she was possessed whenever she questioned his decisions. Camilla was devastated, afraid to return to any church. Marina hugged Camilla and said, "You're not possessed, you're hurt, and this isn't your fault. But here, you're not alone. We're going to help you heal." In the following months, Marina closely accompanied Camilla, talking with her regularly, connecting her with a Christian therapist who understood religious trauma, and gradually helping her rebuild her faith in a healthy environment. Camilla was not the only one. There were dozens of stories like hers, people who had been manipulated, controlled, humiliated by religious leaders who abused their authority. And each story reinforced in Marina the certainty that the work they were doing was essential. It wasn't just about changing one church, it was about changing an entire culture. Meanwhile, news about Pastor Marcelo began to circulate. He had tried to assume leadership of a church in another city, but when members of that region's pastoral council learned about his removal, they refused to credential him. He tried to start an independent church, but few attended. His reputation had been irreversibly tarnished. Part of Marina felt sorry for him. After all, she didn't wish harm on anyone. But another part knew that consequences were necessary. Leaders who abuse power need to be held accountable, not only for justice, but so they don't hurt more people. She prayed for him, asking God to touch his heart and lead him to genuine repentance. But she didn't feel the need to seek him out or forgive him personally. Some wounds take time to heal. On a special Sunday, 6 months after the beginning of the entire saga, the church organized a restoration service. It was a moment to publicly acknowledge all the people who had been hurt during the previous ministry and ask forgiveness on behalf of the institution. The new permanent pastor, who had been chosen by the congregation, conducted the service with sensitivity and humility. Marina was one of the people called to the front. Along with her were Roberto, Bruna, Vanessa, Mr. Antonio, Mrs. Maria, and several others. The pastor read a formal statement, acknowledging the mistakes committed, asking forgiveness, and committing never to allow that to happen again. Then he invited the congregation to stand and applaud those people, not for being victims, but for having had the courage to fight for justice. The applause was deafening. Marina looked around and saw tears on so many faces. She saw Julia, sitting in the front row, clapping with a huge smile on her face. She saw Donna Celia, who had been her confidant from the beginning, crying with emotion. She saw Vanessa, who had risked her own friendships to support her. And she felt, for the first time in a long time, that she was truly home. After the service, several people approached Marina. Some just wanted to thank her. Others wanted to tell their own stories. An elderly lady, whom Marina didn't know, held her hands and said, "I've been a member of this church for 40 years. In recent years, I thought about leaving several times because of the injustices I saw, but I didn't have the courage to speak up. You gave me that courage. Thank you." Marina smiled, with tears in her eyes. "You don't need to thank me. I just did what anyone should do, defend what is right." The lady shook her head. "No, my dear, many know what is right, but few have the courage to fight for it. You are special." In the following months, Marina continued her life normally. She worked, took care of Julia, attended church, participated in the support group, but something in her had changed. She was no longer the shy and insecure woman who accepted injustices in silence. She had discovered her voice, and she was determined to use it whenever necessary. A year after everything began, Marina received an unexpected invitation. It was from a national organization that worked with church reform and combating spiritual abuse. They wanted her to join an awareness campaign, traveling to different cities, telling her story and teaching people to identify and combat abusive practices in their religious communities. Marina hesitated. She had a daughter to raise, a stable job, a life that was finally at peace. But when she talked to Julia about the invitation, her daughter said something that surprised her. "Mum, I think you should accept. Because if you help other people, other children won't need to ask if they're important. They'll already know they are." Those words deeply touched Marina's heart. She accepted the invitation, but with the condition that she could make the trips on weekends and during school vacations so as not to be away from Julia. The organization agreed. Over the next 2 years, Marina visited dozens of churches throughout the country. In each place, she shared her story, answered questions, listened to similar accounts. And in each place, she saw transformation happening, people finding courage to question, leaders reflecting on their practices, churches implementing changes. She didn't change the world alone, far from it, but she was part of a larger movement of ordinary people who refused to accept the status quo and fought for a more just, more egalitarian faith, more like Christ's teachings. And that for Marina was more than enough. Today, when Marina looks back, she no longer feels anger or sadness. She feels gratitude. Gratitude for having found courage. Gratitude for the people who supported her, gratitude for the opportunity to make a difference, and above all, gratitude for having taught her daughter the most important lesson of all, that justice is not a gift we receive, but a conquest for which we fight. The church where it all began continues operating today. The pews no longer have reserved signs. Offerings are managed transparently, and all people, regardless of how much they donate or their social position, are treated with equal dignity and respect. It's not a perfect church, but it's a church that learned, the hardest way, that the gospel cannot be bought, and that God's table has no VIP seats. And Marina, she continues sitting in the back of the church, not because she's forced to, but because she chooses to. Because she discovered that God is not more present in the front rows than in the last, and that what really matters is not where we sit, but how we live. And you, if you were in Marina's place, would you have had the courage to question, or would you have accepted injustice in silence? Comment, justice or submission. I want to know your opinion.